Hegel is perhaps the most misunderstood philosopher in history. We don't even need to first understand him properly in order to know this for certain, and that's because he's the only philosopher in history to be interpreted in two completely opposite ways by his readers. Some people like Bertrand Russell and Jean-François Lyotard see Hegel as the ultimate philosopher of totality and systematic closure, while others such as Slavoj Žižek and Catherine Malabou see him as the philosopher of radical openness. The fact that there are two large factions which interpret Hegel in literally polar opposite ways seems to imply that at least one of them is completely wrong. In this video, which is the first part of a two-part series, I'm going to be discussing Todd McGowan's fantastic book, Emancipation After Hegel, Achieving a Contradictory Revolution. This video will focus specifically on the philosophical and theoretical aspects of the book, while the next one will focus specifically on the political and historical aspects. The thesis of this book is that the central aspect of Hegel's philosophy is contradiction, and that according to Hegel, being is contradictory. Let's take the law of identity as an example, which states that A equals A. Up until Hegel, philosophers took this law to be axiomatic. It was an absolutely certain foundation that could be built off of. Hegel, however, demonstrated that A equals A can't be simply accepted without engaging in speculative analysis, as identity always implies and contains difference. A cannot be A without the non-A, or B. A always implies, and therefore necessitates, the existence of B. Furthermore, in simply stating that A equals A, we have introduced difference by distinguishing the two A's. Bertrand Russell critiqued Hegel for supposedly not understanding the difference between predication and identification. A equals A is a statement of identity, not predication. To say that Hegel was a German philosopher from the 19th century is also a statement of identity, but to say that Hegel was tall is a statement of predication. According to Russell, by not accounting for this distinction, Hegel was led to the absurd conclusion that the law of identity undermines itself. But the Hegelian response is to point out that there are no pure statements of identity, as every identity undermines itself. Every act of identification becomes predication, and the predicate is always unable to fully capture the essence of the subject. In fact, identity emerges through the failure of predication. It is the je ne sais quoi which eludes capture. Identity is nothing but separation. It is itself the act of being other to the other, which is why identity is negativity. A always necessitates the existence of B, yet they're both only themselves insofar as they're distinct from one another. A contains difference within itself, and so does every identity. But this doesn't mean that there's no such thing as identity and that only difference exists, as Gilles Deleuze would claim, but that there is an identity of identity and difference. To be an identity is to persist despite the internal contradiction of containing one's own self-destruction. This is why, for Hegel, the goal is not to eliminate contradiction, but to find a path to sustain it. This is not to say that we just contradict ourselves, as the speculative method is to work through a particular in thought to reveal how it contradicts and sublates itself. You can't do this speculative work by simply dogmatically accepting contradiction. The method of speculative philosophy is to work through seemingly ordinary propositions and to reveal their inner contradictions. This is why Hegel doesn't attempt to create a new form of logic which would escape the contradictions of formal logic. Instead, he works through formal logic and demonstrates how it negates itself. This is how ordinary propositions become speculative. As McGowan puts it, quote, "The difference between ordinary and speculative propositions is not an objective difference. There are two different ways of approaching propositions. One reads propositions either as ordinary or as speculative. Ordinary propositions that eschew contradiction are necessary even for the speculative philosopher who aims to reveal the necessity of contradiction. One must begin by treating propositions as ordinary in order to discover that they are actually speculative. If one begins by treating all propositions as speculative, one paradoxically misses contradiction by finding it everywhere." Unquote. It must be emphasized that McGowan doesn't limit contradiction to mere abstract thinking. He's a Zizekian insofar as he thoroughly embraces the ontological interpretation of Hegel. Unlike most readers of Hegel, however, McGowan sees contradiction as the essential aspect of Hegel's ontology. It is only through contradiction that there is negation, and it is only through negation that there is identity, movement, and action. Contradiction, then, is necessary for being itself. It is its animating force. Since contradiction is so essential to Hegel's philosophy, it shouldn't come as a surprise that he speaks so highly of the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus. In order to understand this, we must dispel a common misinterpretation of Heraclitus, one which is based on his famous Fragment 91. In this fragment he states that, quote, "It is not possible to step in the same river twice," unquote. This quote would seem to suggest that he was merely concerned with the flow of time, which is not an example of contradiction and is also not that illuminating philosophically. However, one must only read his Fragment 49a to see that Heraclitus does indeed affirm the actuality of contradiction. To quote him, "We step and do not step into the same rivers. We are and we are not," unquote. This affirmation of the reality of contradiction is, according to McGowan, what unifies Heraclitus and Hegel at this level. However, since Heraclitus was a pre-Kantian philosopher, he evidently wasn't able to deal with the questions and problems posed by the idealist tradition. This is why he begins with nature in order to demonstrate the actuality of contradiction, while Hegel begins with subjectivity. According to McGowan, one of the most significant limits of Hegel is that, through no fault of his own, he was born too early. Specifically, he was born before Freud discovered the unconscious. With the discovery of the unconscious, Freud proved that humans aren't driven towards harmony, but towards sustaining their self-destruction. The unconscious, unlike the conscious will, doesn't pursue what is good, but what is satisfying, and satisfaction is only found in the pursuit of an object, not in the attainment of it. Thus, the subject contains an internal division between its conscious will and its unconscious desire. Furthermore, desire is itself contradictory insofar as its essence is to pursue its object, but to attain the object is to lose the enjoyment associated with it. Take, for example, the rich man who continuously buys expensive cars. He believes that his enjoyment is found in the cars themselves, when in reality he finds enjoyment in the very act of accumulating them. This is why he'll never truly be satisfied. And it should be noted that Freud only comes to this understanding of the object of desire after his discovery of the death drive. The pre-death drive Freud simply considered the object of desire to be traumatic on account of its incestuous character. However, with the discovery of the death drive, Freud realizes that it's not merely that the object is itself traumatic, but that there is no object which could ever satisfy one's desire, and that it's the confrontation with this impossibility that results in trauma. Desire can never be satisfied, even through reconciling oneself with the incestuous object, as desire only exists in failing to arrive at the object one consciously desires. This is the death drive. It is a barrier to the subject's self-identity because it pursues an impossible object and prevents the satisfaction of its desire, yet it can never consciously know or will this. Ironically, Donald Trump provides the perfect example of someone who, at least outwardly, recognizes the reality of the unconscious drive and how satisfaction is found in the pursuit of the object. The following is the very first sentence of The Art of the Deal. Quote, "I don't do it for the money. I've got enough, much more than I'll ever need. I do it to do it." Unquote. While Trump does indeed perfectly describe the nature of the unconscious drive, he's limited by the fact that he seemingly sees himself as already having attained the desired object and is now simply engaging in business deals because it's fun. However, if we are to accept the findings of Freud, we must conclude that Trump is deluding himself, as there is no object which could ever satisfy his desire. While he may not be engaging in business deals in order to gain more money, he nevertheless isn't doing so simply because it's an enjoyable activity to add on top of his already fully satisfying life. Trump's activity is fueled by a lack that he simply fails to see, and because of this, he's unable to see the reality of his internal contradiction. Now, Hegel, unlike Freud, sees reason as the only way to recognize the essential nature of contradiction. This is, in fact, the uniqueness of the human being, and it's the power of human reason. Hegel distinguishes reason from the understanding, as reason has the unique ability to think through contradiction and to reconcile itself with it. But without speculative philosophy, one necessarily considers contradiction to be limitation, expressing nothing true of reality itself, which is taken to be a harmonious whole free from the stain of contradiction. This is the problem Kant faces after discovering the antinomies of reason. One such antinomy involves the attempt to conceptualize a beginning to the universe. It's not necessary to discuss why and how he does so, but he comes to the conclusion that the universe is both finite and infinite, and that it has both a beginning and no beginning in time. Kant uses these contradictions as proof that human reason is necessarily limited, and in attempting to grasp that which is beyond its limits, it's necessarily led into contradictions. He limits reason and emphasizes the understanding, creating the table of categories. Hegel viciously attacks the table of categories, calling it a disgrace to science, as Kant doesn't deduce the categories themselves as necessities of the structure of the understanding itself. And as opposed to following Kant in his critique of reason and his emphasis on experience, which is the domain of the understanding, Hegel critiques the understanding and emphasizes reason. For Hegel, reason is higher than the understanding because it internalizes and thinks through contradiction, to quote McGowan. Hegel's celebration of reason for its ability to think contradiction entails a critique of the understanding for its failure to do so. Whereas reason discovers its truth when it encounters contradiction, the understanding never even approaches it. The understanding is reason's foil. In the Introduction to the Science of Logic, Hegel lays this out clearly. He says, "The contradiction is in fact the elevation of reason above the restrictions of the understanding and the dissolution of them. The understanding avoids contradiction by restricting itself to the field of possible experience. The superiority of reason stems solely from its ability to think contradiction rather than avoiding it." Unquote. This privileging of reason over the understanding can actually be traced back to Plato. In the Republic, he critiques the understanding as being limited by its relation to sensible objects, as in the case of geometry, while dialectical reason is able to think the forms themselves. Just as Kant's understanding is confined by the limits of experience, the understanding privileged by the geometrists of Plato's time is confined by the sensible objects they base their knowledge on. As Plato himself says, reason proceeds from ideas, works through ideas, and ends in ideas. Similarly, Hegel's reason deals solely with the concept, which is the identity of identity indifference, which is contradiction. Thus, while Kant attempts to demonstrate that any attempt to use reason to answer metaphysical questions fails, and in this way makes room for faith, Hegel embraces this failure and rejects faith. In fact, it's only in recognizing contradiction through reason that the subject can become free, and it's this ability that distinguishes the human from a mere animal. The subject has the unique ability to internalize and reconcile itself with contradiction as opposed to simply being conquered by it the way natural entities are. Nature exists in contradiction while the subject can think it, and in this way it internalizes contradiction and frees itself from the immediacy of nature. Spirit is able to recognize that it negates itself, just as Martin Heidegger's notion of Dasein attains its existential singularity only in its being towards death. However, while Heidegger considers Dasein as in the world and finite, Hegel considers spirit to be alienated from the world and infinite. It's infinite in the precise sense that it's able to escape the confines of the finite natural world by ceasing to be a mere victim of its forces. To quote Hegel's introduction to the phenomenology of spirit, quote, "Whatever is confined within the limits of a natural life cannot by its own efforts go beyond its immediate existence. but it is driven beyond it by something else, and this uprooting entails its death. Consciousness, however, is explicitly the notion of itself. Hence, it is something that goes beyond limits, and since these limits are its own, it is something that goes beyond itself." Unquote. And to return to the concept of the understanding, we must note that while Hegel does consider the understanding to be limited due to its inability to think through contradiction, he also praises it for its ability to divide the world into concrete entities. This is what makes experience itself possible. Before the genesis of the understanding, the world is simply a mass of data, and not a harmonious whole. It's only with the understanding that distinct entities as such arise, as distinction isn't a category of the natural world. As Georges Bataille puts it in his essay Hegel, Death and Sacrifice, quote, "The flies remain equal to themselves like the waves of the sea." This seems contrived. A biologist can separate a fly from the swarm, all it takes is a brushstroke. But he separates it himself. He does not separate it for the flies. To separate itself from the others, a fly would need the monstrous force of the understanding. Then it would name itself and do what the understanding normally effects by means of language, which alone founds the separation of elements, and by founding it founds itself on it within a world formed of separated and denominated entities." Unquote. The understanding is precisely the power of the biologist to distinguish one fly from another, a power which the fly itself does not possess. The understanding is capable of dividing itself from the world and dividing the world into distinct entities, which makes experience possible. However, Hegel's claim is that it's nonetheless limited by the fact that it's unable to recognize that division involves identity in difference, and objects are not mere self-identities. This is the role of reason, which doesn't heal the contradictions involved in every identity, but does allow for freedom by making it possible to become reconciled with the reality of contradiction. Thus, we've now determined that the rational subject is both itself contradictory and capable of recognizing contradiction. However, we've yet to provide a precise definition of subjectivity itself. The following is a relatively long passage from the book, but extremely important nonetheless. Quote, "From Descartes on, the concept of the subject has two distinct meanings. On the one hand, it is the act of thinking that doubts all its representations and has certainty only about its capacity for doubt. It is divided against itself, thereby distinct from the self-identity of substance. But on the other hand, subject names the entity at the center of the Cartesian world that has a secure knowledge of its clear and distinct ideas, ideas underwritten by a God who doesn't deceive. The former subject is unable to know itself fully or attain self-identity. The latter acts like the master and possessor of the world it surveys. One of the chief reasons for the misreading of Hegel is an emphasis on this second conception of subjectivity at the expense of the first. But Hegel holds unfailingly to the first, to the subject as split from itself. When we examine Hegel's thought with this conception of subjectivity in mind, everything changes." Unquote. McGowan follows Zizek in understanding the subject not as a self-identical entity that subsumes the world into itself, but one which is itself only insofar as it's divided from the wealth of its own content. To learn more about this understanding of the subject, see Part 1 of our series on Zizek's Hegel in a Wired Brain. Now, according to McGowan, subject is the name Hegel gives to self-division. Understood in this way, the meaning of Hegel's famous statement that substance is subject becomes clear. Substance is subject because it's self-divided as well. Furthermore, the very existence of subjectivity in the sense of self-consciousness is proof that substance must be divided, that there must be a certain crack in reality itself that allows for the emergence of the self-divided entity known as the human being. This is what Spinoza is unable to grasp with his notion of the self-identical substance, which everything is but a particular mode of. The very existence of thought proves that substance can't be purely self-identical, as thought is divided against itself and yet nonetheless exists. Hegel, against Spinoza, believes there to be some disruption in being itself which makes the emergence of language and thought possible. And it is only through the concept that this disruption in being can be thought through. The journey of the concept begins by transcending the limits of natural immediacy by introducing identity and distinction into the world, and then transcending the understanding by uniting the other to itself through grasping the identity and difference. In other words, the essence of the concept is to unite identity to the other while nonetheless preserving difference. This is why McGowan considers the Hegelian concept to follow the same logic as love. In love, one unites oneself to the other while nonetheless preserving difference. Similarly, conceptual thinking reveals identity in what appears to be merely external, while nonetheless preserving the difference therein. To quote McGowan, quote, "In Hegel's thought, the concept does not exist in isolation, but relies on a negation that undermines it while simultaneously sustaining it. In order to be what it is, the concept must involve itself in what it isn't, which parallels the structure of love. If we try to keep a concept pure from its negation, we lose the concept itself, just as trying to have love without the other deprives us of love." Unquote. There is no identity without its negation, and this is its imminent contradiction. Furthermore, the concept isn't merely abstract thinking. It's only through the concept that thought faces the test of being, as in working through contradiction we come to realize its actuality, the fact that it isn't merely confined to the realm of thought, as Kant had believed. The actuality of contradiction is what McGowan emphasizes throughout this text, as he considers all pre-Hegelian philosophy to be limited by its inability to grasp this reality. This is evident in Kant's emphasis on the forms of space and time, as space and time allows us to mistake contradiction as difference. Rather than seeing entities as being both themselves and what they are not, we divide them through space and across time. To quote McGowan talking about his own identity, quote, "What I would become informs what I was, and what I was informs what I have become. I had an identity as a young boy on the basis of the fantasy of my future self becoming a professional football player, and my present self exists on the basis of my fantasy of my prior self as an adequate college football player. At all moments, what I am not remains integral to what I am." Unquote. If we're thinking solely through the forms of space and time, we are led into believing that there's no contradiction here, but mere difference. But for Hegel, rather than seeing experience as a terrain of differences in space and time, experience is a terrain on which contradictions play out. To experience in the Hegelian sense is to grasp the internal contradiction of an identity. For example, to experience perception is to grasp its dependence on other things, which is its negation. And this is why to privilege experience in the phenomenological sense is to limit oneself to the confines of difference and to avoid conceptual thinking. While Husserl gives priority to experience over logic, Hegel's insight is that experience without the logical concept is nothing at all. We require the concept for anything to become for us. While it's true that the experience of the mountain comes first in a chronological sense, it's only through the concept that the mountain becomes a mountain as such, and not merely a meaningless lump of data. An animal experiences a mountain without the concept, but this experience lacks meaning and is not yet for itself. Hegel's privileging of the concept results in his simultaneous privileging of love, as they both share a structural homology. This is why Hegel's ethics are one of love, which are distinguished from Kant's moral law. The Kantian moral law simply assumes that the world is completely indifferent to it, which is why to act morally is to act without regard to any externality. But this is an impossibility, as one always acts with regard to the world one finds oneself in. And aside from making a purely moral act impossible, the Kantian moral law also runs into the contradiction of being absolutely distinct from, yet necessarily dependent upon, the world. In love, by contrast, we unite ourselves with the other instead of considering it to be a mere externality unrelated to ourselves. In encountering the other, our own identity is disturbed, which forces us to recognize that we ourselves are never self-identical. This results in our ability to forgive the other, as we realize that the same contradiction in it is also within ourselves. The early Hegel was actually a Kantian, and he embraced many different religions insofar as they embodied the moral law. He saw Christ as merely removing the legalistic aspects of Judaism at that time. However, it didn't take him very long to recognize Kant's limitations, which ultimately drew him to a less ecumenical interpretation of various religions. He came to see Christ as the ultimate moment in the history of religion for one precise reason. The crucifixion is the moment when the ultimate substance is shown to be subject, and in this way makes room for universal love and freedom, to quote McGowan. With the advent of Christianity, the God of the beyond, the substantial God, reveals itself succumbing to the same contradictions that humanity endures. God ceases to be one and becomes a subject with the death of Christ. This Christian event frees us from the image of a substantial other, a divinity that has a harmonious self-identity. The subject who experiences the death of God through Christ's crucifixion is a free subject, though most Christians retain the idea of a substantial and indecipherable God located in the beyond who survives this crucifixion." Unquote. Jesus Christ is the moment when the substantial God of the beyond, the absolute authority, reveals itself to be subject and to contain contradiction within itself. This event is what makes universal love possible, because it's only by internalizing the death of God that one can recognize the universality of contradiction. Only by seeing every identity to be just as self-divided as ourselves can we love one another as equals. And this love must become actualized in the risen Christ in order to avoid the eternal failure that constitutes the Kantian moral law. Quote, Hegel contends that Christ must rise from the dead so that Christian love will not fall into the infinite longing that befuddles Kantian morality. The risen Christ and the emergence of the Holy Spirit bonding the community together represent the actualization of love. In this community, the subject is at home in absolute otherness, an achievement only possible thanks to the Christian event. Unquote. McGowan is in agreement with Hegel that it's only by passing through and internalizing the Christian event that we can arrive at the absolute, because absolute knowing is simply recognizing substance as subject, which happens at the grandest scale with the death of Christ. To recognize substance as subject is to recognize that nothing escapes contradiction and that contradiction is intractable. Quote, when thought arrives at the absolute and thereby achieves totalization, the status of contradiction undergoes a thoroughgoing transformation. At the point of the absolute, thought can no longer seek the resolution to contradiction through another dialectical movement of thought. At the end of Hegel's philosophy, there is nowhere left to go because Hegel has explored all possible logical resolutions. Though other empirical possibilities surely exist, none promises any novel pathway out of contradiction. The absolute is nothing but the affirmation that contradiction is unsurpassable. At the position of the absolute, we recognize that we cannot ever eliminate contradiction, no matter how long or how hard we strive to do so. Unquote. And this is why the common misinterpretation of Hegel's dialectic as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis not only misses the mark, but is the exact opposite of Hegel's method. TAS stands for opposition, and opposition is inherently ideological as it presupposes a stable self-identity. We ought not to conceptualize the dialectic as a self-identical thesis confronting an external antithesis, but as the thesis generating its own contradiction and negating itself. It's only by thinking in this way that we avoid the rigid distinction between good and evil, or self and other, that characterizes all forms of ideology. If one is to attain absolute knowing, one must recognize the same evil and otherness found in that which is external to be an essential aspect of one's own identity, which opens up the path to forgiveness and reconciliation. And reconciliation is not synthetic, but the recognition of the necessity of contradiction as the driving force of life. In this way, Hegel dramatizes any given position instead of synthesizing it with another, revealing the necessity of its contradiction. For example, if we think through art using Hegel's speculative method, we realize that every art form is the failure of spirit to express itself. In architecture, this failure is evident as the subject attempts to express itself in what is mere material. In sculpture, this same failure applies as it remains external to spirit itself despite taking the form of the human. Painting reveals a more difficult contradiction as it allows for the expression of the singularity of spirit on the canvas, but it still takes a material form. And finally, in poetry, we reach a form of expression that isn't dependent on any external material. However, Hegel's point is not that poetry allows for spirit's full expression of itself, but that it also fails to do so. In this way, we realize that the failure of spirit's full self-expression was never the result of its dependency on externality, as in architecture, sculpture, and painting, but is the result of its own self-limitation. To reach the absolute is to reconcile oneself with this self-limitation by recognizing that there's no way of surpassing it, and that contradiction is universal. While the universality of contradiction may seem to be a pessimistic conclusion, it is, according to McGowan, the very basis of our freedom, which will be explored in the next video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. This was a long and complex video, so I truly appreciate everyone who watched it all the way through. If you enjoy our content and would like to see more, and also if you would like direct contact with myself, please consider becoming a patron and supporting the channel. Also, make sure to follow us on Instagram and join our Discord for frequent updates and to join our community. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and may God bless you all.